Call Alfred Naro.
Mr. Speaker, I am constantly concerned when I hear that member talk about the issues and the rights of the offender over the rights of the victim. Mr. Speaker, he actually turned around and said that there was electioneering. Well, Mr. Speaker, if we've gone out and we've said to ordinary Kiwis and New Zealanders that we're going to embark on a comprehensive program of reform to protect communities, to prevent crime and put victims first, if that's electioneering, well then, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what that speech from that member is actually all about, because ordinary, everyday New Zealanders want to know and ensure that their safety is actually taken paramount by this Parliament. Mr. Speaker, what I'm also looking forward to after the first reading is for when this goes into the Select Committee and hearing submissions, I'd like that member to look into the eyes of the Sensible Sentencing Trust, Mr. Garth McVicker and the family members, and tell them that the rights of the offenders are far more important than the rights of the victims, that all the things that we're doing in this legislation is punitive. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is important. We know that the number of offenders we are talking about is only between 5 and 12. But, Mr. Speaker, the impact that that has on a community is huge. The trauma, the tragedy, all of these things that we know are significant in a community. It can never be understated, Mr. Clendon, that what we are trying to do here is to put the rights of the victims and ensure that our community is safe. This is absolutely not punitive, as the member has talked about. So let's address some of these issues. Well, first of all, he talked about the concerns that it's setting a precedent for this type of detention order. This is a civil detention order. There are already civil detention orders that are already used as part of other regimes that protect the community from harm. These include detaining people with highly contagious diseases or individuals who have a mental health or intellectual disability issues that make them a danger to others or themselves. The bill does not affect the functioning of other civil detention regimes. Secondly, Mr. Clendon talked about the bill that overrides offenders' rights. The bill appropriately balances the right of New Zealanders to be free for almost certain serious harm versus the liberty rights of offenders who have served their sentence. By holding individuals in a civil detention facility and allowing them a high degree of autonomy where possible, the system responds proportionately to the legitimate objective of protecting citizens from almost certain harm. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Clendon also talked about the legislation is inconsistent with human rights legislation and international obligations. So let's just spell this out really clearly. The PPOs are civil orders, not criminal punishments, and their sole purpose is to protect the community from near or certain future harm. I'd like to know what that member of Parliament that's here today would say that if an offender had gone out and sexually and violently harmed a member of our community, what would be the speech from that member? What would be the response to the family members? What would be the response to the community? What would be the response to New Zealand as a whole? Would he stand up and say this? Let's look at this legislation. It's been punitive to the offender. Well, I guarantee that member would not do that. He can say all the words that he wants, but this legislation is important to protecting the rights of ordinary New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to this legislation, going into Select Committee, hearing the submission. I look forward to sitting down and actually being alongside that member and hearing the submissions from members like Garth McVicker, who talk about the importance of balancing the rights of individuals to ensure that the trauma and tragedy of violent, even sexual offending that has to New Zealanders as a whole. Mr. Speaker, this is a good legislation. I think it's important. It's well balanced. I commend this legislation to the House.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr. Speaker, New Zealand First will